Ladies and gentlemen, you're very welcome to this afternoon's session on the climate benefits of Swedish export in the Swedish pavilion at COP26. My name is Gustav Bergström. I'm the Trade Commissioner of Sweden to the UK and Ireland. I'm very glad to see so many of you here, both in person as well as on our live session being broadcasted right now. Sustainability and enhancing people's lives are long-standing drivers for Swedish innovation. In Sweden, entrepreneurs, investors, researchers and policymakers have a proud record of joining forces to develop bright ideas with life-changing power. Today we are here to discuss the climate benefits of Swedish exports. In a recent report from Material Economics, it was documented that in 2018, Swedish exports generated climate benefits equivalent to 26 million tons of carbon dioxide. This was a result of replacement of less cream production in other parts of the world. According to calculations, in the next 20 years, it will be possible to more than double the direct climate benefits of Swedish exports. With us here today, we have a number of Swedish actors that are in the forefront when it comes to contributing to the green transition, both in Sweden and globally. First up on stage, I have the pleasure of welcoming Mr. Christer Nilsson, State Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Welcome to the stage, Christer.
Thank you so much for inviting me to the stage and to the beautiful Swedish pavilion here at COP26 with the theme of pioneering the possible. I think that's part of the topic for this afternoon session, discussing what is possible and how can we scale up the implementation of what we see are the technologies and the products that are in the forefront. And of course, visiting COP, coming here, also shows that it's a sense of urgency. It has been for a long time when it comes to the climate issue, but we have the challenges presented in the recent IPCC report that underscores that we have to look into all the different possibilities we have. But it also strikes me that it's promising because walking around the different pavilions, meeting people in the corridors, meeting parts of the business sector yesterday, you see that there are lots of solutions. And many questions that comes to me like an evening like yesterday is how can we scale up? How can we create more reach for the possibilities? And businesses, innovators, scale-ups are looking into what could be the effect, what could be the contribution if our solutions could have a global reach. And of course, working as me as State Secretary on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, working with trade, that's encouraging because that makes a very clear and positive task for us to work on when it comes to export and trade. And especially since I've been State Secretary, Minister of Environment many years ago. I don't know which COP, but it was long ago when we were working on the Kyoto Agreement. So seeing now the new momentum coming here to COP26, where what we are discussing here in these pavilions with the large contribution also of the business sector, directly goes into what are the abilities of making new commitments. I think it's so important to see the dialogue and the borderless contribution between what is being discussed here and what is being discussed in the negotiations. So it's a new mechanism compared to at the time I was in the Ministry of Environment, and I'm very glad to be here today and discussing the possibilities and the scale-up. So, of course, when we see that we have these positive solutions, we have the possible impact, trade and export must and could be an important tool. But it's also something that should foster enabling different initiatives. We have been talking about that today. How can we address different particular challenges? How can we create more financing for good solutions? How can we have a fair distribution globally of technologies and how to work? And that is, of course, something that could be addressed based on the discussions that we have here today. And export and trade should be translated into a lower emissions and the possibility to have higher ambitions when it comes to a low carbon economy. So it enables initiatives, commitments and financing. I think that's very promising. So what we see is that export and trade can scale possibilities, but it is also important that we then work with new standards, norms and frameworks. And I think that is one of the dialogues that we have here today as well. How can we, with trade, together with the business sector and also the market itself, define what are the new standards, what are the new needs and what should be promoted? Because it's obvious, trade in general, without being the best products, best manufacturing, the best solutions to high standards, if we don't have that, of course trade is not per se positive. We need to focus on what also to trade with, and therefore I'm proud to be here representing Sweden and also with the dialogue with the business community. So another thing that strikes me coming into COP26 is that we are seen as a front runner, talking about Sweden and the Team Sweden that we often talk about. When it comes to carbon pricing, the decoupling system approach and energy infrastructure, innovation and cooperation. And I think that is just a few sentences that has been presented to me during the discussions. This is where they see that we should have more of cooperation. I think including that in what we do is very important. And I think when we talk about the benefit of Swedish export, of course we have to go back and see what are the starting point. Why are we able to have this discussion here today? And we will learn more about it during this panel and this session. But I think it's important to just highlight, and you have been talking about that of course before. One key element is the carbon pricing since the 90s. Lots of interest now, we see that's on the agenda. What has been the importance of transforming industry, transforming different sectors. We have a discussion on how we have created infrastructure and production when it comes to the energy sector, focusing on renewables, but also low carbon technologies. And that is also something that we get lots of questions about, and that's a part of why we can stand here today on this topic. The high level of R&D that was mentioned by Gustav in the introduction is of course something that has been important, and we are a leader in innovation. I think that's why we also can say that we pioneer the possible, we have technologies in the forefront, we have companies that are on the edge of being the real front runners in different sectors. And that's why we can say that if we increase the reach for Swedish companies, we also can see an impact. But we also have the society that has embraced the change, and we can say that it's absolutely true. We have decoupled economic growth from CO2 emissions. We have decreased the CO2 emissions with 24% and tripled the GDP. We had the other discussion here before. We have meetings with the delegations from developing countries. Having this as a very strong argument I think is good. We create new jobs, we make the transformation real and to the benefit of society. So when it comes to the trade policy for climate and the different parts of what we are now working on a policy level, I think it's important to say that in general we work of course to increase the Swedish export on climate smart technologies. That's the first leg on this policy. We also work on the climate initiative that we want to take place on the WTO meeting in the end of November. And we also work on a new framework. I have taken national steps of changing and creating new framework for export financing to see what should we finance with our export credits and what should we not. Making the export credit system also be a part of the transformation and a part of what are the solutions that we want to promote. And these examples and these three priorities, I said export and increase export. This pavilion is actually a tool and a part of what we do together with the World Exhibition and Expo and what we do there. But also the bilateral agreements and discussions that we have with countries here, looking into how can we together make a change. How can Swedish companies be established in other countries? How can we expand innovation and the technology sharing? But we should also work within the EU to change the trade negotiations to include sustainability in a good way and also climate. Also working on the subsidies to fossil fuel that we have to raise. We have to develop the trade agreements in a very good way. We need to have green procurement. We have to have a starting point, as I said, at the WTO meeting with a climate agenda, saying what should be the achievements forward. How can we eliminate tariffs on green goods and services in order to work on how trade can be a part of scaling up to good solutions. And finally, reforming the agenda for the export credits. And we saw a small step by the other week where we are now taking the next step internationally, but also nations have a large responsibility, and we have made a reform for the Swedish system when it comes to export credits. So to summarize, I think we have lots of technologies that we can promote, and trade can be a part of the solution. And I think that trade and transformation is working in parallel. So by supporting trade and new technologies by export, we also include the perspectives of how to develop standards. What are the combination countries that we should work with? Other regions that we have to have initiatives on standards or technology transfer. How can we build capacity in countries to be a part of the trading scheme in general, but also when it comes to sustainability and climate solutions. So I think it's a very good insight to see that this is something that we do in parallel and should do in parallel. I just also want to say that you already mentioned, Gustav, there has been different ways of calculating the positive effects of the Swedish companies and the Swedish solutions when it comes to export. We will listen more to you, Magnus, when it comes to your work on this same topic. And I think as all different parts of policy making, this should also be based on the facts and the truth. And we have to learn more about how to calculate, how to create the systems. You talk about the transparency in the sector of knowing what are the comparable technologies, what are the comparable effects that we need to take. But I'm sure that what we see is it's a great potential, but we have to build the system. And I think this seminar, not only saying that trade and export could be a part of the solution, should also be a starting point for us discussing how can we create a framework and the system that enable us to bring it to international level. So I think partnership is needed. We have to work globally. We say pioneer the possible. We should pioneer the possible together. And let's act together. Also when it comes to export and trade for climate as a theme. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to be a part of this panel later on and listening to some of the experts that we have invited. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. State Secretary. Next, I would like to welcome Mr. Magnus Ebon, who is Head of Research at the Global Challenges Foundation and also Principal at the Lund University, and he will discuss accounting for the climate impact of exports. Welcome, Magnus, to the stage.
Thanks a lot. Do you hear me now? Okay, good. So, thanks. Very nice to be here. I just, I can see the timing here. So, my name is Magnus Ebon and I'm currently head of research at Global Challenges Foundation. But what I'm going to talk about today is work that I have done in my role as researcher at Lund University, and it's work that I've done together with Astrid Kandor, who's professor in economic history at Lund University, and also other researchers in Australia, Norway and Switzerland and so on. So it's a collaborative work. I will not go into details about this, but what we have done basically is to develop a method to account for the climate effects of trade that is supposed to satisfy certain formal conditions or criteria. And we published an article in Nature Climate Change in 2015, and we continued to develop the methodology after that. So the first question then is why trade matters, and why it matters is that it's for climate mitigation, and nearly 1/4 or around 1/4 of the global emissions are related to traded goods. So it's a very large share of the emissions that we are supposed to try to crowd out that are related to production of goods that are traded across borders. And for a small country like Sweden, that is also a small, very trade dependent country, it's a much larger share. So close to 40% of the territorial emissions in Sweden are related to production that for export, and close to 60% of the emissions that were generated in producing goods for Swedish consumption occur in other countries than Sweden. So if Sweden wants to do something that has global climate impact, then we need to take into account how both our export and import has impact on emissions. So trade can impact emissions in many different ways. It can increase the emissions. Obviously, transportation increases emissions, and those emissions are not in the official records of territorial emissions. So that is one way that it also affects the scale. So trade has the effect that it increases the efficiency of production and therefore increases the level of consumption. So trade makes us richer, and by being richer we emit more carbon dioxide. It also affects the composition of what we consume. We wouldn't consume coffee and chocolate if there wasn't international trade. So what we consume is dependent on trade. And then what we have looked at is, in particular, is sourcing. That is where the goods that we consume are produced. That can affect emissions. It can increase the emissions or it can decrease the emissions, depending on whether the sourcing leads to a more efficient global production pattern or if it leads to a less efficient production pattern. So there has been quite a lot of attention to the risk for carbon leakage, so that if a country like Sweden has stricter climate ambitions or climate rules, that could lead to high-emitting industries moving to other countries with less strict rules. That is carbon leakage. So that would increase emissions, but it could also lead to more efficient production. So normally trade leads to efficiency gains. So if countries trade according to their comparative advantages with regard to labor, for example, then we can produce more goods with less labor hours. And similarly, if we do manage to get international trade to follow our comparative advantages related to emissions or energy sources, then we can produce more goods with less emissions. And that would be this. And then, of course, it's also very important for technology diffusion. So, therefore, to be effective, national climate mitigation policy must take into account the impact of foreign trade on greenhouse gases in other countries. There's no point in reducing your domestic emissions in ways that increase emissions somewhere else. But also trade offers possibilities, especially for a small country like Sweden, to have a much larger impact on global emissions than what our size really. So there has been much attention then to the impact on emissions from imports, how imports affect emissions in other countries. But there has been considerably less attention to how export impacts emissions in other countries. So there's been a lot of discussion about the need to take into account consumption-based emissions. We need to take a consumption perspective to our emissions. And that is something that has been pushed forward by the environmental movement, especially in developed countries, for many years. So consumption-based emissions, you don't need to read the mathematical formula, but basically you calculate it by starting from the territorial emissions, and then you add all the emissions that took place in other countries in producing goods that you import, and then you subtract the emissions, the domestic emissions that are related to goods that you export. And for most high-income countries, including Sweden, consumption-based emissions are much higher than your domestic emissions. So for Sweden, for example, the consumption-based emissions are 40% higher than our domestic emissions. And the common interpretation, and for developing countries it's the opposite. So developing countries often have much larger production-based emissions than consumption-based. And the common interpretation is that we export our problems to developing countries, that we clean our own backyard by throwing the garbage to the neighbor, so to speak. So Christer Nilsson talked about how Sweden has been very successful in pushing down emissions while having economic growth at the same time. But there has been critique to that image by saying that, yeah, that is true, but only if you look at the production-based emissions, not if you look at the consumption-based. Actually, in later years, I think that we are also pushing down the consumption base, but this has been but the problem is that it does not take into account how emissions in other countries are affected by exports, because what you subtract is the emissions that took place in your own country. So just as imports generate emissions in other countries, exports reduce emissions in other countries because it crowds out other production. So to get the balanced image of the effect of trade, then you need to take into account both sides. So I'm just going to give you one simple example, or not simple example, one example where this goes very wrong. So Sweden produces clean electricity, and we produce more electricity than we use, and we are connected by grid to our neighbors. So we export quite a lot of electricity. And this is only the direct export of electricity. We also export a lot of electricity that are embodied in goods. So we export 35 terawatt hours and we import 9 terawatt hours. So we have a net export that is 15% of the total Swedish electricity production. And if we just look at the export to Poland, which was 3 terawatt hours in 2019, and we imported at the same time 0.2 terawatt hours from Poland, and the net result of that is an increase in Swedish consumption-based emissions. And that is not due to exporting problems to Poland, of course. It's only due to the fact that Sweden has so much more carbon-effective electricity production. So in this case, and that is actually, I think, in the official consumption-based figures that the Statistics Sweden put forward. So in reality, of course, Swedish net export of electricity to Poland resulted in a large reduction of emissions, and it's on the scale of 1.5 to 2 million tons. So that's quite a bit compared to the Swedish total emissions of 50 million tons. But that is completely invisible in both production-based and consumption-based accounting. So the problem is then that if you formulate your national mitigation targets only in terms of production-based reductions or consumption-based reductions, then maybe the most important things that we can do will go completely under the radar. And it can, so actually from a reduction ad absurdum, that what we should do here is that we should cut the grid to Poland. Then we would save emissions in Sweden, but that would be very bad for the climate. So how can you calculate it? I see that the time is running now. So what you do simply, the logic is simple, but the methodology is somewhat complex. You compare the export to what the alternative production would most plausibly be. And you can do that in many different ways, and that takes modeling, economic modeling, and it takes some kind of counterfactual reasoning, and you need to come up with some kind of plausible idea of what would happen. So what material economics do, they compare with the most plausible alternative on the relevant market. For electricity, for example, we have a common European system, so you can look at what would be the next production facility on the European market. Whereas what we did in our research is that we looked at the world market average. And the reason for that is that one desirable property in carbon accounting is additivity. You want like, if you summarize all countries' emissions, then they should sum to the global emissions, because otherwise you have a risk of double counting. You have the risk that everyone reduces their emissions, but global emissions continue to increase. So there are different pros and cons in different methods, and I don't say that our method is the best one. My personal view is that you should pick a method that works with that particular. So from a scientific perspective, I think that the existence of different methods is not a problem. From a political perspective, I think that is a problem, because you need to have a clear picture of what is happening. So just one thing. It's important not only to look at only the import side, but you shouldn't look only at the export side as well. So maybe one problem is to talk about the climate benefits of exports as one area, because one thing, the environmental movement doesn't like that, because export of steel is not good for the climate as such. But you should perhaps talk about the climate impact of foreign trade and look at the balance between how your import increases emissions in other countries and how your export decreases emissions. And what you should strive for is that, so does your export reduce emissions more than your import increases emissions? If you do that, then you do actually trade according to comparative advantages. And that is, so one problem then is that in ordinary standard trade theory, you have production factors that have a cost for the producer, and then trade leads to comparative advantages. But the problem with carbon is that you don't pay for it, so therefore there is no mechanism. So maybe if we want to, so carbon pricing, I think, is a key to creating mechanisms that go in this direction. So I think that was it. Thank you.
Thank you, Magnus. Very, very interesting session. So next up is our panel discussion, and I would like to welcome the panel participants to the stage. Mr. State Secretary Christer Nilsson, please welcome up, and Magnus, please take the stage again. Okay, next up, Mr. Johan Söderström. Johan is a EVP EMEA at Hitachi Energy. Marie Trogstam, please come up. Marie is the Chief Sustainability Officer at AFRY. And then Tomer Shalit, who is the Founder and Chief Product Officer at ClimateView. Great. Let us start with you, Mr. State Secretary. Trade promotion is key to Swedish diplomacy. Considering that sustainability and Paris alignment is at top of the agenda of the government and part of the business model of Swedish companies, this implies a great potential for Swedish exports to contribute to global climate benefits. Could you please explain how Swedish export promotion works in practice?
Yeah, am I on? Yeah,
Yes.
You hear me? Very good. I will just respond brief so we can also listen for the different panelists that joined us here. But I think it's important to say that we see directly that we have a possibility to make a change. I mean, we have different methods of course calculating, but when we see that fossil-free steel could replace other productions of steel in manufacturing, in producing vehicles, in building steel constructions, of course that is a direct benefit and reduces emissions, and I think that's important for us to say and see. Also, when we can help in building new infrastructure of energy production, for example, where we have the flexibility for the sourcing of energy, where we have the possibility of creating innovation, and we don't build in dependency on fossil fuels. I think that is clearly something that we can see as a benefit that is not maybe a possible trade-off between export and import. I think politically we have to look at it on both a more complicated but maybe more simple way, where we are looking into the different alternatives. What we then do, and in practice, as you asked, very much is a discussion on being in dialogue with different countries. They have their national plans due to the Paris Agreement. They are looking for what are the possibilities for us to actually reach the targets. They know they have to transform energy sector, transport sector. They have to have more digitalization in order to make this possible. And they come to us and say, what are the solutions that you know? What are in the forefront when it comes to what your companies can do? Is it possibility to build a memorandum of understanding where we can share knowledge? Can we also build in a relation and possibly an investment with some of the Swedish companies? So it's a very proactive bilateral dialogue with many countries on this particular topic when they want to achieve their goals in the climate policy. And here we are doing that, and in Expo we are doing that, and next year we will have this conference in Sweden, Join Sweden, in pioneering the possible. So we are doing different activities on that river.
Thank you very much. Over to Magnus again. I would like to ask you, Magnus, how do you see that Sweden can contribute to a green transition and reducing global GHG emissions through foreign trade?
Yes, thank you. Yeah. So one thing is that, as we have heard, Sweden has one comparative advantage, or we have several comparative advantages here. And I think that we have very good access to cheap renewable energy, and that has been a very competitive advantage throughout the years. And we also have a strong industrial tradition in heavy energy intensive industry. And we should perhaps see that as an asset and not a liability when it comes to climate mitigation, because that gives us leverage, that gives us an opportunity to have much more. So we should to try to trade according to our comparative advantages. It's more important to decarbonize the steel industry than to transform the industrial structure to producing apps instead of steel and cement and paper and pulp, so to speak. So that is one. And another is that we also have we are an innovative country, and what we should do then, and also the Swedish industry is at a high level and produces not so much products that compete on price, but rather on quality. And it's easier to take the initial cost of, for example, entering into the hydrogen economy when you have that kind of production than if you're a country that competes with cost. So what we should do is that we should take the lead in innovation, technological innovation, but then make sure that does not stop there, that the technology is diffused to other countries that need it, because we are still a small country. The really big impact is if we can develop technologies that will then decarbonize the steel industry in India and China and so on.
With trade.
With trade, yes.
Thank you, Magnus. Very interesting. Take this off. Johan, Hitachi Energy has a very strong heritage of driving the green transition across the globe. What is your perspective on how Swedish companies can contribute to the green transition, particularly within the future power system?
Thank you, Gustav. Very good question, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me to start with this little thing? We have been in business since more than 100 years, and we're going to be in business more than 100 years to come. We have still a couple of center of excellences with good heritage, high voltage direct current to connect regions, to connect countries, to connect cities, villages, and give electricity to all, SDG number 7. We have also another center of excellence that's to increase the power quality of alternative current networks. So we're enabling today many people out in the world to get hold of renewables. Renewables will grow with a factor 10. We feel that we have a lot of support from the Swedish government, from academia, Magnus, from other stakeholders, from cities, etc. So we co-create a lot. We're also following a lot what's happening in Sweden on the industrial side, as you mentioned, with the Green Steel movement, where we are part of that as well. We want to buy green steel for our assets, and we want to be part of electrifying the companies. So I say that the future is very bright from that perspective in what we are doing. And also on Poland, I have good news on Poland. I don't think we should stop the link, because Poland is massively moving now to offshore wind. The price for carbon is starting to work in Europe. So I met Mr. Kosowski, the PSE CEO, recently, and they're really moving ahead. So I think from that perspective, it's really positive. And we are hiring. So if you're interested to go to Hitachi Energy, we used to be ABB, now we're Hitachi Energy, we're hiring. The CTO stands there, Gerhard. He wants to employ a lot of people, women and men, young and old. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you hear me? I don't hear anything.
Yes, very loud and clear. Thank you for that, Johan. Marie, over to you. You're representing another Swedish company that is really out there pushing the limits. How do you see that Swedish companies can contribute to the global green transition through exports?
Thank you, Gustav. And as we know, Swedish companies are really front runners. We hear it all the time. We have set ambitious targets to really reach the net zero well ahead of 2050. And many of us are also part of the exponential roadmap. But what I think is key is to figure out what is your biggest impact. And as for a company as AFRY, in design, engineering and advisory services is of course through the solutions we provide to our clients. And then speaking about also one concrete example, which is our sustainability policy, where we've said we should actively seek out transformative and innovative assignments, clients and partners. And also we have our first sustainability target is to speak about net positive impact. And I think that's the area where Swedish companies being transparent about the challenges we are facing. For example, mining. We know, everyone knows, of course, there are also negative impact in terms of mining, but it's completely necessary for the electrification to happen. So being transparent about that, and as for AFRY, we address it through intelligent mining systems, addressing also the health aspects and of course human rights, circularity, etc. So I think Swedish companies combining all our climate efforts but also being responsible companies where we can really push ahead.
Thank you, Marie. Tomer, it's really great to have you in the panel. You represent Climate View. We had a really interesting discussion before, so looking forward to your comments here. You're representing a more of the startup scene here today, so it's great to hear your views. You call yourself a Swedish climate tech company, and you normally put emphasis on the Swedish part. Could you please elaborate a bit more on that?
Well, two things, and I follow on what Magnus and Johan said here. First of all, innovation, and I think you said co-creation. We as a startup in the very beginning, we were a tiny company working with Vattenfall, the big energy company, working with the Swedish Climate Policy Council, Swedish Energy Agency, and Swedish Environmental Agency, and literally building our first prototype together, getting together literally in a room, working for several months, building a prototype of our transition platform. The kind of getting that cross collaboration from companies, from the climate experts, gave us a fantastic leap ahead and a real technical edge, which hard to find any other way to accomplish. So that's the sort of innovation side. And then, as a startup trying to reach out to the world, actually the fact that we are ahead and that we have that we are working with the Swedish government gives us a lot of credibility and very good references. So there is an understanding that Sweden is ahead, and it shows in the platform. So two things, and just follow on just what you're saying.
Good. Thank you, Tomer. Back to you, Mr. State Secretary. Tomer, he was discussing the notion and the importance of kind of collaborating across various parts of the system. Could you elaborate a bit more on this kind of model and how we work in Sweden to between government, academia and business to promote innovation?
Yeah, I think it has been very, very important for us doing this, working together. Also, when we have the initiative now called Fossil-Free Sweden, since we have the ambition to be fossil-free by 2045, the whole concept of working together, sector by sector, large emitter by emitter, to see what is needed in order to reach the long-term goals in that particular sector. What can the business sector do? What should the government do? What is the research that is needed? And how can we create the support for the change also among civil society, trade unions that actively support that we change and transform the industry? I think that's quite amazing as another part of the sector. And I think that transparent, open dialogue has been very important. We are the one or the second largest funders on research and development when we compare the EU countries, largely thanks to the business sector, but also in relation to a commitment that we from the government supports with our education system, that the funds that we do are supporting the initiatives from the business sector, that we also have a dialogue on the long-term promotion and what we do here, export and trade. I think there is a kind of contract which means that even if it's, in this case, about innovation is seen as in a context that you know that we can get use of it. We can work together with the government to implement it. It will be an agenda for legislation. We will work together on the EU to see that we promote these proposals technologies that we can work. So I think, Johan, for example, you can maybe get even more into the details of how this is working from you from a company side. But for me, I would say that it's a long-term, broader perspective of cooperation that only in the innovation, which I think is more or less like a contract of that we do this together. And the Fossil-Free Sweden has been a new innovative way of working that I think we see lots of the results today, where we in different sectors can say that we have the companies in the forefront with lower emissions in the manufacturing and the products. And maybe one last comment. I think what that approach have meant for us is that we have changed and transformed manufacturing. And I think that's important because that also means that you bring in the suppliers, the different sourcing, but also working on the different markets. So I think by transforming manufacturing, we have had an impact that is broader than just working on sourcing or products. Manufacturing has been, and transforming industry has been the key in the whole value chain, which I think is an advantage with how we have focused and worked together. Thank you.
Johan, would you like to pick up on that question?
A long timer in Swedish industry, more than 35 years, and I can reflect that the collaboration piece has been super instrumental. What I want to add is that the collaboration with the startup companies has been really beneficial. In the beginning, we were a little bit like Secret Service. In the big companies, we didn't allow startups to come in and enjoy our laboratory investments, etc. Now when we have done that in a much better way, we have been able to co-create, and we learn a lot from the startups, and some of the startups are growing quicker than us as well. So it's a phenomenal thing that's happening. And then academia as well, super important, and the support from organizational bodies like Vinnova setting up the financial piece. But Marie is onto it. If you're really committed transparently to sustainability, then you make business out of that, because transparency is paying off. Capital also go to green companies for real now, and that's a real good shift. So I think that is a really good shift.
Thank you, Johan. I know, Magnus, you wanted to comment.
Yes, I just wanted to point out one other thing that Sweden could actually do to improve this, and that is on the more global political level. So what we want to do is to use trade as a tool to promote climate mitigation, and it could be an effective tool by making trade or making production more efficient. But there is a mismatch between trade rules and global climate goals. And Sweden could take it, like being a very trade-dependent country that has an ambition to use trade in this sense. We could also take the lead in how can we align the WTO rules better with the climate goals, for example? How can we make the UNFCCC and the WTO work together to make sure that we use this tool as efficiently as possible?
Challenge accepted.
Thank you, Magnus. I'd like to come back a little bit to the collaboration aspect and ask you, Marie. I know that you at AFRY really emphasize the importance of being transparent about the challenges ahead. Would you like to expand a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I could build on what we already said, and that is, once again, the holistic view. We'll need to look at the full value chain and the different dimensions of sustainability. Of course, the climate is in focus, but we also need to bear in mind that biodiversity is kind of the major challenge coming. So we need to tackle those challenges simultaneously, but also transparency comes together with bravery. And as for AFRY, we said, to really walk the talk and show, as of 1st January this year, we said we are not entering any new coal-built fired power plants, just to show by concrete measures this is the way forward. So also, that goes hand in hand, I would say.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you. Tomer, back to you. And coming back a little bit to the export question, how do you see that Swedish exports and the Swedish sustainability brand opens up doors for you globally? I know you've been opening up doors in America. We discussed that before. Could we please discuss that a bit?
Well, very concrete. It opens doors. By joining forces with, say, Business Sweden or one of the large corporations, we get into rooms that a small startup would never have a chance to do otherwise, but we come with a lot of support, and really makes a difference.
Thank you. I don't know if we have any comments from anyone or any points you'd like to bring up.
Maybe one in addition. I mentioned the export credit system, and I think what we are discussing here today, and we had discussions earlier on carbon pricing and how we can use different initiatives. But I also think, and I want to go back to the export credit system, where we have said that we should not have export credits for extraction of fossil fuels by the end of next year. We dismantled that. We have the coal plants that already we have said we should not support with export credit. I think that's a way of walk the talk, that we have lots of activities that we or plans that we need to bring forward. And I think we are doing that, and we are working then as a nation with changing our system, and we've done that. But equally important, we need to work with other countries and see that how can we grow alliances, how can we move ahead when it comes to the recommendations and the framework with the OECD, how can we have the WTO to step up. So just to one other example of what I think in the end will have effect also on export and trade. because that's what this export credit is about. So it's not only to just say that we should promote what we know today is best and better, but also changing the system so we can say, if you change your products, here is the benefit you will get from the export system. So I think it's different ways. I just wanted to mention that as well.
Thank you. And Marie?
Yes, just to build on that, and we had a session this morning how we could actually use then the Swedish and Nordic know-how to leapfrogging the technologies also into developing economies. But in order to do that, the team Sweden, as you, Johan, referred to, will be completely necessary. So the role Swedish companies could have really through the exports and services abroad, I think that's key with the great support from the Export Credit Agency and everything that you're doing here.
Any other comments on this? Okay, Magnus?
I want to pick up with what the State Secretary said about growing alliances. I think that's also a key, and I think that Sweden could play a very important role there. So one key issue here is that we need not leave the developing world after. So technology development, it is a competitive matter. So once you have a very good technology, you want to keep it for yourself. But I think that there's a very strong case to create alliances that include the developing countries in key technologies, for example, like hydrogen, pushing forward the hydrogen economy and so on, to make sure that that is not something that each country does for itself or Europe does for itself, but that we make sure that it's also something where we have China and India and Africa with us on the road.
Yes, I think totally agree, and I think it's so important, both in building capacity, but also transforming or making technologies more global and to different markets. And I think our Swedish companies that are truly global from the beginning, they are quite good at working at that level as well, introducing innovation systems in the countries where you're established. So I think companies already work with that kind of offer, so to say, but we as government must also do it more, and therefore last week we presented Sustainable Transformation through Economic Partnership, STEP, which is actually an initiative between all the different relevant agencies and corporations when it comes to SIDA and, for example, Business Sweden. How can we put the export and trade system together with a developing system and create a kind of mutual understanding and working together to have more effect on how to work with the developing countries. So it's not only the clear business cases, but we should also work with the development side of our portfolio and to work that. So it's happy that you asked the question or made that comment, because that gave me the reason to tell you about the initiative we just took the other day, and I hope that will leverage on what you say.
Thank you. Johan.
We are a global company and we work in almost all countries, and we need to do more. We had a panel yesterday where we talked about the Angola project where we supply digital substations, also financed by EKN SEK, and providing electricity and also local jobs in Angola. We had a discussion here where we want to invest more into Nigeria step by step, and we are already big in South Africa. We want to be bigger. We talked to one of our big clients yesterday. So I think it's important that Sweden is Sweden, but we also can find coalitions and how we can get the finance system for Sweden married to the Japanese system now to get even more money to spend on the right way to accelerate the transformation also all over the world, also to the countries who need it.
Yeah, we follow up that discussion in 10 minutes.
Thank you.
How we will
I know,
merge
we have
this.
a meeting.
That's very good. No, but I also forgot also mentioning what I think about building alliances. When we are here now, we talk with the large institutions, we talk with the World Bank. I think it's important, to your point, Johan, that we saw it's not only the sourcing of financial resources that we have in our portfolio, it's also about working internationally to support, but also together with other countries, of course. So being a small country, I think we have had the history of working in partnership and with like-minded, and now it's even more important. So yeah, we will do that.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you, Tomer, here, because we're touching the financing side of things, and there is a new climate tech wave in Sweden. You are really part of it. You raised funds here during the spring, I believe. Could you elaborate a bit more on the kind of innovation coming out of Sweden at the moment?
Well, it's very concrete. There's quite a few climate tech companies in Sweden that have got substantial backing, funding from VCs. I think it's a bit of the Spotifys and the Klarna and that wave of good engineering, good Swedish engineering culture and innovation. And now people are waking up and want to use that innovation and that technology for more important purpose. And we have the ecosystems, and we actually have some of the money which sort of gets feed back into the system. So there's happened a lot just the last few months. It is a bit of a wave, yes.
It's great to hear. We have a few more minutes. I don't know if we have any other remarks or questions, I guess, from the audience.
While you think of the question, it's so good with all your comments because it reminds me of what we do, and I have the reason to tell you. But what we also discussed in the D9+, which is a like-minded group of European countries that want to be the front runners when it comes to digitalization. The last session we had in Luxembourg was focused totally on digitalization and sustainable development and / climate. And of course, discussing digitalization, new companies, how we should focus, and together with the Commission that were present, discuss how can we embrace, support and grow your sector when it comes to high-tech digital solutions that works in favor of sustainability and climate. So I think we have to learn more, we have to discuss more of the wave that you describe, how can we include that in the policy development as well.
Okay, I think we will conclude this session, and I want to thank the Mr. State Secretary for joining and the rest of the panelists, and also to the audience tuning in and being present here at COP26. Oh, sorry, we have a question, apologies. Do we have a microphone?
I would like to, because I'm particularly interested in technology transfer to Africa, and we do know that Africans do not have the financial means to afford these technologies. And even if maybe the government will allow you bring those technologies to Africa, but will the local people, like the grassroots people, be able to afford these technologies?
I think if I should start, I think what we can and must do is making sure that the investments is done, because in some different products and some technologies, I don't think it's the cost for the end consumer that is the biggest difference. The biggest difference is when you should actually invest in the different technologies, the different infrastructure. And there we can do a lot, and we do that, and must have the dialogue and the initiative I said together with the different agencies of the government is important, that we talk to the World Bank. I think financing is a very important part of this COP26 as well. But having said that, I think that we should of course also see that we have capacity building when it comes to implementation of digital solutions, for example, working with that in different means and for the broad perspective of people. And I think the dialogue you had before, the different panel, the panel before, actually addressed that question. And maybe some of you that participated there can fill in, but I think there are lots of available programs for that kind of development. But for sure, really important.
Magnus,
yes, thank you. I want to thank you for the question, because I think that is the real challenge of climate change. Like the issue of how to decarbonize the existing production in the developed world, that is a small problem compared to making sure that we can fuel the development that is needed with renewable energy and so on. And I think that's also, like, the problems may not be the same that we meet. For example, the technologies that are needed may not always be the same. There could be very big possibilities in distributed renewable energy that are independent of grid. For example, more small-scale renewable energy that can fuel livelihoods in rural areas. So it could be that we should focus on different solutions, but also the financing thing that many developing countries are perceived by investors as dangerous and therefore difficult, and that raises the capital cost. So it's much more expensive to build wind power in Africa than in Europe. So that is something that we could also address from a more global level. Like, how can we pool resources to mitigate those risks so that we can unlock the investments that are needed? So those are things that I think that the international community could also contribute to by thinking about how can we attract private capital to markets that are today perceived as too risky.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on also the focus on local entrepreneurs. For example, AFRY, we partnership with Norrsken, and they are now launching really soon their Kigali impact hub. So that's really also important, speaking also of you, to focus on small but quickly scaling up companies and what they are speaking about, impact unicorns. So we should remember the local entrepreneurship together with that.
Thank you for your question. Thank you. All right, thank you everyone.
Thanks a lot.